Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Poetry. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Robert Browning's amazing poem, My Last Duchess. It's written from the perspective of a duke who, it appears, has murdered his wife. And the poem tells the story of this man displaying a painting of his late wife, his last Duchess, on the wall to a person from another family as he plans the next wife. It's an extraordinary poem. It's brilliant. Now, Robert Browning was alive in the 19th century. He wrote this sort of middle of the range, 1842 to be precise. He was quite liberal for the time, quite interested in the rights of women. So it's no surprise that he tells stories like this particular one of women being repressed by violent patriarchal structures. He actually went and lived in Italy with his wife, Elizabeth Browning. And that's quite an interesting story in itself because her father didn't want them to get married, and so they eloped and they went to Italy. She suffered from bad health and they felt that, you know, the Italian air would help. But this poem is set in Italy, so it's a place that obviously he knew well and probably done a lot of research about. It's supposedly based on a real Duke Ferrara, Alfonso II, who was around in the 16th century. So it's worth having a little look at that as well. But for now, I'm going to stop rabbiting on. Let's get started with some analysis. Okay, so let's just start with the sort of subheading that we have to the title of the poem. I'm going to look at the title in amongst the first line because it is repeated, but you'll notice that it says Ferrara underneath the title. Now that's actually a place in Italy and it's the setting of the poem. Now it's seen as quite a romantic place, which is obviously quite ironic given the sort of horror of the relationship between the Duke and the Duchess in this poem. And it was also known as a kind of place of great thinkers, Renaissance philosophy, religion, art, so sort of quite a learned place as well. Now, it is said, excuse me, that Browning actually took inspiration from a real life figure, the Duke of Ferrara, otherwise known as Alfonso II d'Este, and he was around in the 16th century and he killed his wife in 1561, supposedly, potentially by poison, and she was only like 14 years old. Well, 14 when he married her, and I think he killed her when she was 17 before going off and marrying another person. So it does sort of fit with this poem. So that's some quite useful contextual information for you. Okay, let's start by having a little look at the opening. Now, My Last Duchess is the title. It's also in that first line, and there's a lot to be said about that. Let's start by looking at two of these determiners. That is my last Duchess. So that is what we call a demonstrative determiner. It points to something. And in this case, it's obviously referring to the fact that it's a painting, but it's another one of these moments where the kind of notion of the Duchess is sort of dehumanized or objectified. You know, not she is my last Duchess, it's that. And the determiner last is quite interesting as well, because we're thinking, well, hang on a minute, what do you mean? Do you mean that's my previous Duchess, as in there have been many before, or are you saying that's my final Duchess, like that's the last one that there will ever have been? And it's not until the end of the poem that we actually get the answer to that. We also have this possessive pronoun in this first bit as well, my last Duchess. So we're getting the idea of his possessive nature, his controlling nature. She's very much an object that belongs to him. It makes him sound like a collector, which fits with the notion that this is a painting, but also like a collector of wives. So this kind of controlling nature is hinted to here, not just through that possessive pronoun, but also through the fact that she's painted on the wall, i.e. it's not being painted on a canvas, it's actually painted directly on the wall, so you can't move her, i.e. this image of the Duchess is exactly where he wants her to be, in the castle, unmovable, can't be taken away by anybody else, which is one of obviously his concerns about whether or not You know, she's been with other men. So there's this kind of sense of possessing her entirely by painting her on the wall, looking as if she were alive. Now that is a really cheeky narrative hook, because it's got two potential meanings here. You can say, wow, isn't this painting lifelike? Or you can say, oh, looking like she's alive, which is interesting because she's not, as revealed at the end of the poem. He says, I call that piece a wonder now. That piece. So could be the painting. This is a painting now I call a wonder. But again, it could be the woman herself being described as a piece, objectifying her. But the most interesting thing is the adverb of time now, suggesting that previously he did not consider her to be a wonder. So perhaps now that he can put her on his wall and control her, now he can appreciate her and see her as the wonder, potentially, that she is. Right, we now have this reference to the fictional painter of the time. So we know that if this is Alfonso II, that was a real person, but these artists that are being referred to aren't real. So Fra Pandolf. Now, Fra is short for friar, as in a religious man, and that's important to know because of some of these descriptions. So he says, Fra Pandolf's hand worked busily a day, and there she stands. So this could be to do with the artistry. Yeah, this adverb of manner, busily, here, could suggest that, you know, he was slaving away, making it perfect. But there's also a sort of sexual innuendo there about being busy with his hands. It's that first hint of the suspicion. Now, bearing in mind the friar is a religious man, it is unlikely, so it hints to that kind of irrationality of the Duke. And the narrator being the Duke. And there she stands. So note we're in present tense. The painting is personified. She stands, because obviously it's not physically her. But we've got this idea of this, again, lasting image. He's got her where he wants her. Will it please you sit and look at her? So suddenly we've got this awareness that the narrator is addressing someone specific, not just the general audience of the poem, but there is an actual perceived listener. It's actually an envoy from another castle. But this is quite interesting because we've got these polite forms, will it please you, as if it is the person's choice. But notice the way that this part is framed. Will it please you, sit and look at her? So it seems like a rhetorical question, rhetorical because there is no response, either that or it's just being omitted. But it feels more like a hidden command. Will it please you, sit and look at her? Because it doesn't say to sit and look at her. There's a sense that there's no real choice. But this is this kind of idea of the Duke being in control of who now gets to look at the Duchess, because he didn't feel like he was in control of that, supposedly, when she was alive. So now he is the sort of architect of that. He can say who gets to look at her and who doesn't. I said Fra Pandolf by design, deliberately. For never read strangers like you, that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned. Goodness me, this is quite a long utterance. Since none puts by the curtains I have drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me if they durst, how such a glance came there. So not the first of you to turn and ask thus. So lots of enjambment there. He's being a little bit insulting to this person, suggesting that he is a never read stranger, i.e. someone who is not learned. And he's basically saying people like you who don't know art are always going to ask, oh, who's the painter? Like, you know. So he's saying, I'm telling you, just so you know, because I knew that's what you were thinking. Pictured countenance is painted face, yeah, the face of the Duchess. So on looking at this countenance and seeing the depth and passion of its earnest glance, that's quite interesting, okay? The depth and passion, so those nouns, and then of its earnest glance, that adjective earnest. So you could look at that quite positively, saying, isn't she an extraordinary woman? But you could also take that quite negatively in seeing some sort of like sexual connotation there, which is perhaps the way that he was seeing it. you'll probably be asking, what is with this parenthesis, i.e. this bracketed aside? Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you, but I. So again, still talking to the envoy. So that tells us that not only is the Duchess painted on the wall, literally on the wall, he's had a curtain fitted so he can cover her up when he doesn't want to see her, when he doesn't want others to see her. So again, it's this idea that he is the one in control. He is in control of opening up that curtain and allowing her face to be seen. Ultimate control of her in death. Okay, and seem to say would ask me if they durst. Okay, durst meaning if they dared to. So this verb is actually telling us that he is positioning himself to the envoy as someone who should be someone that should be like he should be intimidated by him, that actually people don't dare to ask questions out of turn. How such a glance came there. So he's saying there are some people who would dare to ask me, how did such a glance come there? Now he could mean, who painted it? How is it that this picture is here? Who painted it? But actually, if you look at this here, how such a glance came there. There's this little sort of insult about the glance. You know, why is that woman looking in that way on that picture? Again, it could be looked at positively, but within the context of the poem, I don't think so. So not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Interestingly, because we only have the narrative voice of the Duke, we've no idea whether or not the envoy actually did ask that question, because the Duke is controlling the narrative. There are never any responses or interjections from this other character, the listener. Okay. Right, now we start really getting into the jealousy and the suspicion of this narrator of the Duke. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Technically it's a metaphor, because what we're talking about is a blush. So the idea of joy being in the cheeks in that colour red. Now he's basically saying other men were able to bring a blush to the Duchess's face. And then he gives these suggestions of how or why that blush might have been upon her cheek. But he frames it with this adverb, perhaps. Yeah, so you get a doubt. We know that he doesn't know that this happened. He's just sort of hypothesizing. So maybe perhaps Fra Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce a faint half flush that dies along her throat. So this first one, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, is all, it's meant to be seen as quite flirtatious, because wrists were sort of, you know, slender and beautiful, and he's saying like, oh, you know, it's too covered up, show more of your wrist. Flirty friar that the the Duke is imagining. But then he says, again, imagined, this dialogue, it's imagined flirtation. Paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half flush that dies along her throat. So we've got two examples of personification here. The idea that paint would not be able to hope to recreate something so beautiful. So, oh, you know, paint will always be disappointed that it can't produce beauty like your face. But then we get this little sinister tone. To reproduce the faint half flush, again, another kind of idea about blushing, that dies along her throat. So, yes, personification, but something dying along her throat sounds very violent. It almost sounds like a slit throat. So you've got this little bit of foreshadowing here. Not saying that he killed her in that way, but certainly foreshadowing death. Such stuff was courtesy. Now that noun is interesting, isn't it? Because having seemingly been placing a lot of importance on the Duchess's, you know, supposed inappropriate behaviour, smiling and blushing, he then just refers to it as stuff. so it minimises it. He says such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. So he's drawing upon the fact that women were expected to respond in a certain way to male compliments, which would be to be bashful and blush and smile. So he is allowing that as an idea, but notice the way that, again, this is narrative control. The Duke is reporting what the Duchess supposedly thought about this imagined flirtation. So it's like he's creating these narratives in his head, and he's no idea whether that actually happened or not. Okay, now we're still using polite forms. Okay, look at this within the parenthesis. She had a heart. How shall I say? Like he's suggesting that he's trying to be careful with his words and how he phrases this, like, you know, to not be insulting, to be polite. So she had a heart too soon made glad, too easily impressed. So this is really very euphemistic in its tone. You know, the heart was too soon made glad, too easily impressed. He's basically saying she fancied everyone, you know, really, but in these euphemistic terms. There's a little bit of anaphora as well, too soon, too easily. I know it's not quite at the beginning of the line, but it's a sort of the beginning of the two utterances. Too soon made glad, too easily impressed. There's a real criticism there. And then it builds into hyperbole. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. So she likes everything she sees, and she looks at everything, i.e. she likes everything. Again, note the way that he's sort of making decisions about how she felt here. Sir, 'twas all one. Now, I've got this little exclamative, which demonstrates that the Duke is perhaps becoming a little bit more impassioned as he speaks. And the 'twas all one, I think, more so responds. It could be in relation to this, the idea of she likes everything. So everything she sees is the same because of the way that she likes it. But it can also be in relation to this section here. My favour at her breast. Now that means a love token. So normally a love token would be something like a ribbon that a woman would keep close to her heart. So in the romantic sense, yes, she would keep a gift that he gave her close to. But you could also argue that there is a sort of sexualization of her there by referring to her breast. I'm not sure. I think the first interpretation is slightly better. And then we've got this very kind of symbolic description that this is like the dropping of the daylight in the west. So he's talking about sunset, dropping of daylight in the west. So there's almost a sort of sense of disappointment here, that it's the equivalent of something coming to an end. And then he groups in these other gifts or favours. The bough of cherries, some officious fool broke in the orchard for her. Now, an officious fool, that's a bit of an oxymoron, because officious means someone who is really aware of their own authority, and obviously a fool is someone daft, so they sort of contrast each other. So the idea of this oxymoron is saying perhaps a man or a lover who clearly thought too highly of themselves. It's almost like a challenge to the Duke. But what's interesting is the description of the fruit. So the bough of cherries broke in the orchard. Now, fruit is normally associated with fertility, and cherries are often associated with virginity. So there is a suggestion. It could be, yes, he broke some cherries from the tree and gave it to her, but he could also, another interpretation is perhaps saying that she wasn't a virgin, that other men had been with her before. He then talks about, very important, this bit, broke in the orchard for her, suggests perhaps some sort of complicity, like on her part. Well, he was doing it for her, almost as if she had asked for that to happen. Another possible interpretation. Okay, so the white mule that she rode with round the terrace could potentially be a gift from another man, and the fact that she's riding it round the terrace suggests that she's sort of showing off a little bit, that it's a sort of suggestion that she is demonstrating the gifts that she, you know, has been given by other men. It's interesting the fact that it's a white mule, because the colour white normally suggests innocence. But you could argue that that's juxtaposed with the very fact that she's riding a horse in the 16th century, and actually this lasted all the way up to the early 20th century, it wasn't considered ladylike for a woman to ride a mule or a horse because of having to sit astride it. So there was a sort of, again, like all things, sexual connotations surrounding this idea of a woman sitting astride. So again, it could be a bit of a judgment. It could be a bit of a judgment there about her. But the point is that all of these different things, all and each, would draw from her alike the approving speech or blush at least. Now you might notice that he has repeated blush, or he's used the word flush to describe the same thing a number of times. So there's a fixation on this look. Now, interestingly, blushing is often associated with being slightly embarrassed. You know, you flame, your cheeks flame when, you know, you're slightly embarrassed. It's a kind of etiquette thing. But also a flushed face, funnily enough, can have sexual connotations, i.e. more blood to the face when you're sexually excited. So the fixation on the blushing could also be that. Right, she thanked men. Good. Okay, so the exclamative there and that pause that's being created here, she thanked men. Good. Well, you know, so should she. This all ties into patriarchal expectations. But then he shifts when he says, but thanked somehow, I know not how. So we've got this parenthesis and this deliberately vague language saying somehow. So again, casting doubt on the way she is potentially thanking these men for the gifts. And then he says, as if she ranked my gift, as if she ranked, so disbelief, my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. So his disbelief, what he cannot understand is how in his mind she rates the mule, the cherries, whatever it is, as the same as the fact that he has given her his name, i.e. because he's married her. And so he feels that his kind of gift of heritage and status should be considered more highly than anyone else. Now, rhetorical question, who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Now, this is quite ironic because he's saying, oh, no one would actually care about these things, but clearly he does because he is talking about them in this poem. Trifling means insignificant things, nothing to do with the dessert. Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, so parenthesis here, creates a sense of false modesty. It's very ironic because clearly this dramatic monologue is written in iambic pentameter. It's very, very eloquent, certainly at this point. So perhaps this points to his sort of manipulation and tendency to lie and create falsehoods. To make your will quite clear to such a one, veiled insult towards the Duchess, like, you know, if no one would be able to find the words to deal with a woman like this, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me. Here you miss or there exceed the mark. Note how we're back in dialogue. It's again hypothetical, just like the previous dialogue was. So perhaps this is what he wanted to say to her, but didn't. But think about the strength of it. Look at this verb, disgust. Just this or that in you disgusts me. It's so strong, and it's in juxtaposition to the kind of trivial nature of this or that, like all these little things that she does disgust him. And then here you miss or that exceed or there exceed the mark. The anaphora there, that repeated or at the beginning of the lines, again suggests that there are all sorts of ways that the Duchess clearly disappointed the Duke. And if she let herself be lessoned so she's got to take the lesson from him, so it's again putting the accountability and the responsibility on her, so nor plainly set her wits to yours forsooth and made excuse, even then would be some stooping. So he's basically saying that if she tried to argue against this, it would be stooping, it would be bending too low, it will make him inferior. So he's basically saying, I will not engage in a conversation with her about my perception of her faults. So she's displeasing him in all these ways, but this part has revealed that he was not willing to talk to her about it. Even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Stoop, again, being submissive, like lowering yourself. So he thinks that engaging in a dialogue with her about her behaviour and her arguing back would make him feel submissive or inferior to her. And there's a real bluntness to the way he says, and I choose never to stoop. I will never be submissive. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her. No doubt. Getting a sense, well, why would she smile, no doubt, whenever I pass? Perhaps because she's pleasant, perhaps because she's terrified. But who passed without much the same smile? So we've got this repetition in this rhetorical question. The smile, past her. So he's creating this sort of like dual idea. She smiles when she passes me, but she was blatantly smiling at other people as well. So there's no value in that smile. And then we get this vague language. This grew, I gave commands. So the more she smiled whenever she saw him, the more he thought this means nothing. And so he gave commands. Who to? Of what? We don't know, except for the fact that then all smiles stopped together. So the suggestion is that he has had someone kill her, because smiling stopping altogether, it doesn't mean, oh, she's now unhappy. It means she's dead. You can look at that as a metaphor, or you can use this very nice phrase called periphrasis, which is where you sort of use more words than you need to express a simple idea. And then we go back. Do just note the caesura at this moment. Then all smiles stop together. It's that kind of finality, her death. There she stands as if alive. So present tense and that repetition from early on at the beginning. So slightly cyclical in its structure. There she stands as if alive. So this kind of ongoing life that she is now living in death, because he's painted her on the wall. Okay, we get this incredibly abrupt shift in topic and tone, like he's done his bit. He said all he wanted to say to the envoy. Will it please you rise? So up you get now. We'll meet the company below then. So back into a kind of sense of ordering this person around, but we're starting to get an understanding of, well, what's he doing here? Who else is there? The company below. I repeat. So he's obviously said this before. The Count, your master's known munificence, that means generosity, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed. So here's our revelation. He does intend to marry again. So going back to the beginning of the poem, My Last Duchess, it meant the previous one, i.e. there's another one coming. So what's extraordinary about this is he has basically just told the envoy for the man whose daughter he wants to marry that he killed the last one because she smiled so much. So some people think that's because of a kind of psychological madness. Some people see it as a warning. But in this moment, he is saying, as I've said many times before, I know that he will give me a good dowry. So it's a kind of that money contract. Although he does say that it is his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, that is my object. So fair daughter, the adjective fair, of course, in this case means beautiful, which creates a bit of tension and horror for the reader, because of course we know what happened the last time he had a beautiful wife. And then we have the noun object being used here, which again comes back to the idea of women being objectified, being possessions, like pieces of art to collect. And that ties in so well with this last part, okay? Like before, we don't get the listener, the envoy's response, but note the way that the Duke controls this. Nay, as in no. So whatever he said no. We'll go down together. sir. And then we get this shift in tone and topic again. Notice Neptune though, taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which clouds of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. This is a wonderful moment of symbolism, okay? Because he's pointing out another piece of artwork. Neptune, god of the oceans, taming a seahorse that is rare. You could literally say that that is a direct representation of how he views his role with his wives, collecting these rare pieces, taming them into submission. But when it doesn't go their way, well, he offs them, doesn't he? He kills them. Klaus Innsbruck, by the way, is another fictional character for the sake of this poem. He's not a real artist. Okay, quick note on form. Obviously, this is a dramatic monologue. You can tell that particularly from the way it's one great big long stanza. It is in iambic pentameter. It does use rhyming couplets the whole way through, but what's interesting about it is the way that the enjambment and the caesura breaks those patterns, so you don't read it to the rhyme, which is all about creating that kind of conversational tone of the narrator, of the Duke. Now you can say that because of that, it's really representative of his tone and style, his eloquence, but also his ability to manipulate, for there to be more going on under the surface. That's it from me. Thank you so much for watching. That was quite a long one, but it's a brilliant poem, so well worth the discussion. If you've got any questions, just drop me a line, pop them in the comments, and I will get back to you. Otherwise, thank you so much again for watching, and happy revising.